We're going to move on to Spain, where angry locals are protesting the fact that there are just too many tourists. A week ago, protesters took water pistols to visitors sitting in Barcelona's tourist area of Las Ramblas. Local residents are furious at how over-tourism is putting pressure on basic necessities, including housing and health services. Rents are up more than 70% over the past decade. However, tourism in Spain is just big money, big business. Visitors spending close to $119 billion in the country in 2023 alone. So it's a big issue. Let's talk more about this and over tourism. What is it doing to these areas? And for that, we're joined by Michael Taylor. He is the Managing Director of Travel, Hospitality, and Retail at J.D. Power, a huge name in this industry. Thanks very much for joining us. You know, this is something that's really gaining a lot of steam. Talk about the balancing act that these local treasures, for lack of a better term, the economic importance of foreign visitors, and also making locals happy. It's a delicate balance.
Well, you'd mentioned some of those places in Spain. The gross economic impact of tourism in certain places in Spain, like Barcelona, is 15% of their total GDP for that particular area. So it is impactful, but we're just looking at, as you mentioned, an imbalance. I don't think anybody in the industry, especially myself, thought that we'd see this level of continued tourism as prices have gone skyrocketing into the stratosphere as far as what it costs to actually travel. And so there's been no let up in demand. And as you mentioned before, it's really affecting some of the local housing and some of the local economics of each of these regions. And they're taking a sort of a fun approach of taking water pistols to people dining outdoors in Barcelona and in the Canary Islands, and somewhat harassing in a nice way tourists and asking them to go home or stay home,
right?
Which is a kind of a different kind of way of attacking the problem.
And it's really all over the globe, because just outside Mount Fuji in Japan, I know that one local town put a big fence up, and the tourists ripped the little binding of the fence over so they can snap photos through there. So what about these protests? Why are they happening? Do you think they're going to have an impact? And the fact that they are picked up on Instagram and all kinds of social media out there, is it going to have the desired effect?
Well, Instagram is actually what started this whole thing. That Lawson's convenience store in Fuji, I can't remember the name of the town, it's many syllables, but it has a beautiful view of Mount Fuji behind this convenience store. It's a simple convenience store. And people are taking selfies and doing Instagrams and doing posts from it. And people can't get into the parking lot where the convenience store is actually doing business. So they really started this whole trend themselves. Now, do I think it's going to be successful? No, it's kind of fun to talk about, as I mentioned before. But really, if you want to curtail this kind of activity, you should do what Venice is doing, what Amsterdam is doing, which is taxing that activity. And once you tax something, you'll get less of it. I think that's the best long-term solution. Right now, it's fun to talk about, and it's fun to look at people with very brightly colored squirt guns hosing down American tourists in Barcelona. But really what's going to happen in the long term is taxes are going to make the biggest effect.
Yeah, and you talk about Amsterdam. I read 23 million people visited there. You're talking about Dam Square, the very historic area. Really, how much is too much? And that is when entities such as UNESCO come into play. We talked about Nepal and other areas where they do have these historic areas that are just massively adversely affected when you have just huge amounts of foot traffic through there. So when it comes to cultural impacts of mass tourism, it's clearly having a big impact.
Yeah, there's an old saying attributed to Yogi Berra in this country, is that it's so crowded that no one goes there anymore. And I think that's what's happening here. And places like Bhutan and places in Asia just don't have the infrastructure to handle the amount of people that want to come and see these places.
Yeah, and you talked about Venice, and it's not just people going up and down the historic canals, but the giant cruise ships that go through there, they've been impacted. And look, a lot of people are pushing back on these cruise ships. I know in Alaska, there's a big pushback as well, and I've gone there a lot, and local residents used to tell me, anybody who comes on a cruise ship and says, hey, I visit Alaska, no, you didn't. You zipped through, you jumped off for 15 minutes. So how are areas like Venice responding to the impact of over-tourism they've had on their cities? And what about these measures and pushing back on cruise ships?
Well, and cruise ships are probably the toughest thing to handle because only a couple hundred people get off a plane at one time. A couple of thousand people get off a cruise ship, and they want to see in a very short amount of time the big sights. So they're going to cluster around those things that are very popular in Venice, of course, is with the palazzos they have there. They're very intensive places as far as crowds go, so they really see it. Now, I think that Venice probably has the best approach to this, which is going to take a little bit of time, which again is that taxation. If you tax things, you'll get less of it. And you want to make sure you have a balance of that because obviously Venice does depend on tourism. They just don't want to have over tourism, which is what they're experiencing now.
And a tough thing too, we have to think about the locals that live there. When their housing goes through the roof because people want to rent Airbnb. I read another quote that said, look, these are houses for people to live in, not for tourists to visit. But so how do companies like Airbnb who make a living off that, how can they be better corporate neighbors?
Well, I think that what's happening here is it's the younger people who are doing the protesting because they're obviously on the short end of the property ladder. They're trying to get into those apartments downtown. That's where they want to live. Older people can buy the places and convert them into Airbnbs and things like that. And then places like Amsterdam, as you mentioned before, are limiting the ability of Airbnb to be rented in these particular locations. And I think that's probably what's going to happen here is some kind of limitation of what you can rent and how many units are available in a particular area. And that'll probably be the most successful way to at least curtail this stimulated tourism that we're seeing right now.
Okay, Michael Taylor, thank you so much. And if you want to listen, coming up, we're going to have a report on that community just outside Mount Fuji. So thank you again for your insight.
All right, thank you, Sean.